Well, welcome to a Kerbal Space Program Let's Play with me, Colin Votier. This will be the Red Duna series. I will be recreating the main events from Kim Stanley Robinson's classic sci-fi novel Red Mars. The one major change I'll be doing is the first step in the Red Mars book was a 4-man mission over a period of 7 days to the Martian surface as an extension of the space race between the US and Russia. America put men on Mars first. I will be subbing that out for something a little more realistic and a little more up-to-date with the events of Andy Weir's The Martian novel, which is a series of 4 missions to Mars with a 6-man crew on each, spending 30 days on the surface. But before we can get into any of that, we need to get a communications network up and running, as we do not have that on Kerbal the way they did by the end of the space race on Earth. I've started this already with a small communications network on Kerbal, first with a tower at the inland end of the runway, which I can use as a navigation marker when I'm landing planes, as well as a local communications range. There was a small glitch when I launched it, and it's missing the 5 megameter omnidirectional antenna, so we'll have to go out with Kerbal attachment system and stick one of those on there. In addition to that, we have 5 of a planned 6 low Kerbal orbit communication satellites. Each of these has a semi-major axis of 850 kilometers. So let's take a look at this tower, and then we will launch our final communication satellite, and then we'll take a look at it in the VAB to see what it's like. And then maybe we'll head over and add that antenna to the tower. So here we are at the inland communications tower. You can see we have KGR stabilizer, which is Kerbal joint reinforcement. That's one of many mods we have installed. As you've already seen, we have Remote Tech 2, which is what these dishes are from, and where the missing antenna that should be right in the middle would be from. Kerbal joint reinforcement. This truss is from Speedy's Tri-Strut. It's a rework of the out-of-date trihexagonal struts, which are only up to date for 0.22. Then we have procedural parts, which makes up the base, this central strut piece through the middle, and the fuel tank and battery down here. And then we have Lackluster Labs, where the generator and these 5-ton weights are from. And Kerbal attachment system, as I mentioned before, with pipe endpoint so we can refuel this when needed. Mech jab, as I mentioned. And B9 is where these struts are from, and that's from the new and improved B9 version 5.2.1. It's community rework of the old R4, and they've done a beautiful job with it, especially integrating tweakables to reduce the parts count, which makes a huge difference. So we have on here 3 antennas, or 3 dishes of varying sizes, and that's because the smaller sizes have a wider cone angle. This way, for nearby targets, we can target an entire orbital body instead of a specific ship, and that way it's not point-to-point communications. Anything that floats into the cone will pick up a signal. The distance is only that of one end, not that of both ends added together when working with that, but it's still just a more reliable way of working because you don't have to worry about losing communications as frequently. And we have different sizes so we can get more cone angles. Down here we have the fuel generator. This is using liquid fuel, even though I have Real Fuels installed. Real Fuels leaves the default fuels intact for circumstances like this, where Lackluster Labs is not compatible with Real Fuels. It's using fuel from this fuel tank down here in order to generate the electricity that this needs. And then we have a nice big battery down here with a charge of, I believe, 1672 for if we ever run out of power, plus a little bit on that probe core in there, which is important so that it doesn't de-render, even though it's only a relay to the KSC. We need to make sure it's not counted as debris, as anything without a probe core near the KSC gets counted as a version 0.24.2. You also, if you're observant, might notice down here these little guys. These are just on here really just for looks. They were part of my deployment method using a truck from Lackluster. But they are actually adapter pieces from the model rework for Infernal Robotics. I have that installed as well. My mods list is extensive, and we'll get into more of them later. So let's head over to the launch pad, and we will launch our next communication satellite. Okay, we have had to downgrade our graphics once again, both in quality and size, in order to keep the game from crashing, but we are no longer pegging our processor power. I think we are good to go. But since it's a smaller screen, I am going to have to rearrange things a little bit. So for the flight profile of this rocket, we need to have our target directly above us. So we'll just time warp a little bit. And I'm going to use Smartass's pitch control at 89 just to make sure that we get started facing the correct direction for our gravity turn into an equatorial orbit. Throttle up to full. Fuel, go. Staging, go. Action groups, go. Flight data, go. Heading control, go. We are go for launch. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have main engine ignition. And we have flight release. We have good ignition on our solid boosters and release of launch clamps. We have an initial pitch over. Successful. Okay, so we had some problems with frame rate making the audio unusable from the launch, but what we can see right away is I had to correct for a deviation in the flight path from MacJeb's execution of my initial pitch over to get us going the right direction. As we fly up, I manually override MacJeb to correct for this, and we start getting up going pretty far. Now, with Ferram Aerospace, the atmosphere thins out rather quickly, and you can see that in the fraction of surface level density in the far flight systems window. So I should have pitched over really soon, like 500 meters off the surface. I'm pitching over now to 80 degrees and then increasing to 75 because I realized I did it too late, and I'm doing that at about 1.5 kilometers. Once we do that, we continue to accelerate along our new course, bringing our angle of attack down until it meets our velocity vector and our heading indicator. Then we can turn off the flight computer altogether, and we're using aerodynamic forces to keep us on our flight path out. Here we see that we're reaching supersonic velocities, and the aerodynamic effects really kill my frame rate here. But it's doing some other things that we need to take note of. You see I throttled back, and the reason we're doing that is because if you look in the flight data, Q is dynamic pressure, and that is a factor of velocity and air pressure. We want that to drop off before we bring our throttle back up. There we saw a good separation of our solid boosters. That was something to behold. I actually have very small SRBs hidden inside the nose cones to push those away so they don't collide with the ship and do any damage. Now you can see in the far flight systems we're getting into true supersonic velocity. If you look at the Mach number as we break 1.0, short re-enabling of the flight control in order to keep our heading right. We're trying to keep this inclination as low as possible so that we don't have to spend a lot of fuel in orbit doing a inclination change. Now, as we get further up out of the thick part of the atmosphere, I feel safe to go back to full throttle. Unfortunately, there's something I didn't take into account with a light payload and a powerful engine, especially as the atmosphere falls off, our thrust begins increasing. So let's go back to past me for a look at what misfortune is about to befall this mission. break. Radial radiators. Well, maybe we'll just do a manned mission to repair it later. But we are going to slow down so that we don't get heating effects in atmosphere. That's what I was afraid of. It's alright. It'll cool down. We're getting into thinner atmosphere now, so we're going to switch to orbital mode and go prograde at 30 kilometers. Roll to 0. And switch over to orbital mode. We have main engine cutout and a apoapsis of 130 kilometers with a decent gravity turn. Go for orbital stage separation. Good separation. We are now burning prograde along our arc until we get our apoapsis up to 250 kilometers. We have an inclination of about 3 degrees by the time we reach orbit. Oh, overshot. Crap. We are clear of atmosphere, jettisoning Ferram. Bearing is away. And extending antennas so that we don't lose our communications as we do this. Good antenna deployment. Now, we will need Remote Tech 2's flight computer, and we will need MacLeod's maneuver planner. We need to circularize. Actually, we're not going to circularize because our apoapsis is too high. We're going to change periapsis at apoapsis. And then we're going to circularize at periapsis. And let's see, so we're going to slow down a little bit, which should put us right where we need to be anyway. And we'll be in communications the whole time because we have enough of our network set up to do that. Then we will need to do an inclination change to 0. And for good measure, change semi-major axis. We'll do 45 seconds after the last maneuver node, which will be our inclination change, which will be about at our periapsis anyway. And that will put us in our orbit. Alright, before we do this, or screw anything up, let's save. And separate. See when that's separated that we use sepatrons to pull it backwards rather than an explosive decoupler. And using Tweak Everything, I changed the decoupler force to 0 and 0 impulse so that it doesn't push the payload forward, it only pulls the OIS backwards. Now we can see that it didn't quite make suborbital with those separators, but it was in the atmosphere, so it'll deorbit itself eventually. Or it would if it was within physics range. We know it would, so we're going to go to the tracking station and terminate it. There's something I wanted to try since it was going in pretty low. We shifted focus to the communications tower back at the Space Center, and then time warp around until it's right overhead. This happens to be right at dawn, and with better atmospheres, you've got a beautiful green-blue sunrise. And then looking through, we can see the shiny spot here is the OIS. I wasn't positive. I thought it might have been this other dot over here, but no, it was that. And as we watch it, we know that because eventually it comes into focus as a selected target. I just thought that was so beautiful. Okay, so after that we switch back over to our satellite here. We do a bit of fapping about, changing its orbit to be exactly 850 kilometer semi-major axis and an inclination of 0, or at least within a meter or so that there's minimal drift, as I've done with all the other satellites, and then I rename it to the same naming convention, and we are done with our satellite. So let's head over to the VAB and we can look at the rocket that we used to put that up and what exactly is making up that satellite. So first we can see we have the fuse box mod open here. That lets us know that we have enough power generation compared to power drain on our payload, and it's significantly higher right now because of the alternators on the rocket engines. Second, we have a FASA launch tower. This is a fuel pump into the rocket. By default it's off. We use tweak everything to turn it on in the VAB, and that way we can pump fuel into the rocket and do a hold and release like SpaceX's Falcon 9, as opposed to something like the Antares rocket, which uses multiple solid rocket boosters that drop away in order to fire the next one to change its thrust and ISP as it goes up through its launch profile. And that's actually a derivative of the old Minuteman ICBMs from the Cold War. So it's appropriate to our theme. Getting rid of the FASA launch tower and the FASA launch clamp on the bottom, we can see that we have procedural parts, solid rocket boosters, and a procedural nose cone on the top of that. Now if we take away those nose cones, right underneath we can see I have these tiny little solid rocket boosters that are hidden, and those are to act as separators when we separate the SRBs away. We don't want them to hit the rocket. Moving on from the solid boosters, we have separators, and then we have procedural wings. I've removed all of the wings from Squad, B9, KW, Fire Spitter, and D12 Aerotech in order to reduce my parts count. Our main engine that we have down here is the KW Maverick. We also have a solid motor separator to pull away the booster stage when we fire our OIS. That's especially important if we're trying to make our booster recoverable, because the parachute would be directly under the fairing and the OIS engine. We don't want that engine to damage our parachute. And you can see that we have real fuels installed again here, using kerosene and liquid oxygen for our booster stage, and we're using the stock-alike Real Fuels Real Engine mod to make our engine for all of the various mods compatible with Real Fuels. If I had used Real Solar System, I would have used real engines from that, but these are scaled appropriate to the size that Kerbal and the other planets in the Kerbal system are in the stock game. 2 is the default for this engine, and I'm going to attempt to keep the tech level at whatever the default is for the various engines I use. That way we're not pushing our engines to sci-fi level capabilities. Moving on, we can see a procedural fairing here. Now this texture is one that I've actually made myself, but it's part of a set that I've redone the textures for the fairings using Blackheart's textures for procedural fairings. This one is kind of a mix of B9 and KW rocketry, and this way I've kind of normalized what the white is. The stock-alike white that procedural parts comes with is a little too vibrant for my taste. So moving on, we're pulling away the booster stage and the fairing, and now we can pull away the procedural fairing for the payload. First we can see that we have this 5 megameter antenna, and then moving on we see a procedural decoupler here. Now you can see there what I was talking about earlier, that I set the impulse and the decoupler force to 0, and then I have these angled separators at the bottom,
And those are set up so that they're pointing out far enough that they're not going to hit our payload, but not so much that the back of it is in the way of our main engine. Either one of those would cause us to lose a significant amount of thrust. So now we can ditch the OIS and move on to look at the payload in detail. So it's pretty simple. We have a procedural battery here that has a charge of 500. We can see in Fusebox that we have enough power generation from the RTG that we shouldn't need that at all. But what that's not taking into account is that when you're transmitting data through a relay with Remote Tech 2, it draws additional power. So that's what the battery is there to supply. Beneath that, we have a procedural fuel tank with our Aeroxenon N204 for the engines that we have right here on the side. After that, we can see on the top there's a Remote Tech 2 5mm antenna. Under that, there's the Kerbal operating system core. On the right, you can see a MacLeod module. Then we have these radial radiators from KSP Interstellar Light. And on the far side, there is a deployable RTG from Lackluster. On the bottom, we can see there's a probe core, and that has our 5-kilometer antenna, which is already enabled. That's how we have communications initially, by relaying from that to the 10-megameter antenna on our local communications tower. Then we have a docking port, so that if we ever need to refuel it or change its orbit, we can do that. Okay, so now we can move on. Let's go put that 10-megameter antenna on our local communications tower. So this is my New York City hook and ladder truck, which is mostly from Lackluster Labs, but we also used the Infernal robotics parts to make a rotatable and deployable ladder. And the ladder themselves, along with those railings, are from B9. The first thing that we, of course, have to do is get a Kerbal out and have him walk up and use those Kerbal attachment system strut endpoints to lock down that ladder so it's not flopping around like a dead fish as we drive it around. But then once we do that, we get him back in and we start driving, and we can see this thing moves extremely smoothly and stably. Once we get over to our deployment point, we put down these rescaled lander legs just to stabilize it while we're moving that ladder around. Up front, you can see that we do have a Lackluster Labs storage box, and inside there are 3 small fuel generators to use the liquid fuel from the tanks underneath the trailer to keep this thing powered. The Infernal robotics parts draw a lot of electric charge, and right behind that, that large box is actually a Lackluster Labs Kerbal attachment system storage box for storing all sorts of large parts. So we can use this for construction projects, but also for rescues from a rocket on the launch pad or something like that. So now that we've got that in place, you can see we've been moving our Kerbals around, unlinking those struts, and now we're deploying the ladder and having him climb up it. And once at the top, we put him in this cab so that he can be nice and safe while we move it around. And moving it into final position, he grabs that antenna from Lackluster, which I've enabled to work with Votier, and places it on the tower. There's a minor explosion, there's a glitch with Kerbal attachment system. You can see Bob Fitch's latest videos for more news on that, and I believe a solution is coming in the 0.24 update for Kerbal attachment system. Now, I did try and drive this back and I ended up crashing it pretty badly, so we're going to skip over all that. But I did try to recover the vessel, and it seemed to work, but for some reason there was a glitch in the persistent. It looks like things within the debris recovery range of the Space Center have some glitches, and I don't know if that's from the stock game or with my mod pack. But I ended up just editing the persistent to make sure that I recovered it fully. So that's it for this episode. I'll be back next Monday with my next episode of Red Duna. Next week, we'll begin putting up the next level of our 4 levels of communication satellites, along with the first couple modules of our Kerbal space station. I'm Colin Votier, and this has been KSP Red Duna.